In the heart of Manila, where narrow alleys carried the sound of honking jeepneys and street vendors calling out their prices, lived a quiet boy named Elias Navarro. He wasn't the type who drew attention. He moved gently, spoke softly, and carried a calmness that made him almost invisible in the noise of the city. But deep inside him, something powerful lived, something he never fully understood. It came alive only when he sang. Elias grew up in a tiny rented room with his mother, Laura, a woman whose strength lived behind tired eyes. She worked long hours stitching clothes in a small workshop, yet she always returned home with a smile that tried to hide her exhaustion. Their life was simple, almost fragile, but their bond held everything together. And at night, when the rest of the neighborhood settled into the slow hum of evening, Elias would slip out onto the rooftop. Up there, the city looked different, less chaotic, more forgiving. He'd stand beneath the pale glow of distant stars and let his voice drift into the warm air. His tone carried warmth, a quiet richness that felt too big for the streets below. Some nights, a neighbor or two would pause, wondering where that soulful sound came from, but they never found the boy behind it. Elias was like a hidden melody, heard, but rarely seen. Music became his sanctuary. It comforted him when hunger crept in, when school felt overwhelming, and when loneliness wrapped around him like a cold blanket. Singing wasn't a dream to him, it was survival. A way to breathe. A way to believe that life held more than their small room and struggling days. Still, Elias never imagined anything beyond those rooftops. Dreams like fame, stages, or recognition felt distant, like stars too far to touch. He believed those belonged to people with better lives, stronger chances, clearer paths. Not someone like him. But life has a quiet way of preparing hearts for journeys they never expect. And somewhere deep within Elias, behind all the doubts and all the quiet nights, a golden spark waited patiently, ready to rise when the world least expected it. Music became his sanctuary. It comforted him when hunger crept in, when school felt overwhelming, and when loneliness wrapped around him like a cold blanket. Singing wasn't a dream to him, it was survival. A way to breathe. A way to believe that life held more than their small room and struggling days. Laura Navarro carried her dreams quietly, the same way she carried her struggles, hidden beneath layers of patience and love. While Elias believed life had already defined their limits, Laura refused to let poverty define her son's destiny. She saw something in him that he didn't see in himself. Every time he sang, even in the smallest moments, while hanging clothes, helping her fold fabric, or humming under his breath, she felt an emotion that went deeper than pride. It felt like destiny whispering. But dreams demanded a price. And for Laura, that price was paid in silence. She worked long hours in the cramped workshop where sewing machines rattled non-stop from morning to night. Her fingers often bled from the sharp edges of needles. Still, she stitched with unwavering focus, her mind always drifting back to Elias's voice. She took extra shifts whenever possible, knowing each hour earned brought them one step closer to something bigger, an opportunity she couldn't yet describe to her son. Whenever she walked through the wet market, she'd pause at the posters plastered on roadside walls, advertisements for singing auditions, local talent shows, and, occasionally, international competitions. The words, "America's Got Talent," always stood out. She'd stare at them a little longer, imagining Elias under bright lights instead of dim rooftop stars. With every coin she saved, she sacrificed something else, a meal, new slippers, a doctor's visit she postponed. Elias sometimes noticed the way she skipped dinner or pretended she wasn't hungry, but she always brushed it aside with a smile. She didn't want him to worry. She wanted him to dream. Months passed, and the small jar she kept hidden under her bed slowly filled. It wasn't much, just the fragile hopes of a mother who believed her son deserved a chance to be heard. She never told him what she was saving for, she didn't want to raise expectations she couldn't meet. But every night, as Elias sang on the rooftop, Laura would close her eyes and whisper a promise to herself, "One day, the world will hear him." Her love was quiet but fierce. Her sacrifice is invisible but heavy. And though Elias didn't yet know the lengths she was going to for him, the day he would discover it was drawing closer, changing not just his path, but his heart forever. Months of sacrifice led to a morning Elias never imagined for himself. With trembling hands and borrowed clothes, he stood outside a massive building in Los Angeles, its glass walls reflecting the rising sun and the hundreds of hopefuls waiting to be seen. Lara stayed close to him, her presence steady, her eyes carrying the courage he lacked. Everything felt unreal. The noise, the lights, the cameras, the crowd, none of it matched the quiet rooftops of Manila where his journey began. When his number was finally called, Elias felt his heart sink into his stomach. He looked at his mother one last time, and she simply placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her touch had always been enough to calm storms inside him. Today, it had to calm a hurricane. The stage was enormous, far larger than anything he had stepped on before. The bright lights washed over him, exposing every fear, every doubt. The judges sat before him in their tall chairs, unreadable, waiting. The audience stretched into the darkness, thousands of eyes locked on the small boy who stood alone at center stage. Cameras hovered around him, ready to capture a moment he still feared might not be worth remembering. Elias felt the echo of his old belief return: dreams are for the lucky ones. His throat tightened. His hands trembled. For a moment, he wondered if he even belonged there. But then he remembered the nights on the rooftop. The softness of the Manila breeze. The warmth of his mother's sacrifices. The fragile hope she carried every day for him. That memory steadied his breath. He closed his eyes. And when he opened them again, he wasn't just a boy from Manila anymore, he was a voice waiting to be heard. The first note he released floated into the vast auditorium like a thread of gold. Warm. Deep. Rich. It lingered in the air, wrapping itself around the room. Something happened then, something no one expected. The judges froze. Their expressions shifted, stunned by the clarity and power coming from someone who looked so quiet, so ordinary. The audience leaned forward as if drawn by an invisible pull. Even the production crew paused, forgetting their motions. A voice had entered the room, a golden voice. And in that moment, the world didn't just listen. It stopped. As Elias continued to sing, something within him began to unravel, slowly, gently, like a memory unfolding its wings. His voice deepened with emotion, carrying the ache of years he had quietly endured. Every vibration felt like a piece of his story traveling into the hearts of strangers who had never known his name until today. Up on that grand stage, beneath blinding lights, Elias felt both exposed and free. It was a strange mix, fear melting into a kind of liberation he had never felt before. The golden tone of his voice grew fuller, warmer, as though the microphone wasn't amplifying sound, but amplifying his soul. Images flashed in his mind as he sang: his mother's tired smile, the dimly lit workshop where she spent endless hours stitching, the worn-out slippers she refused to replace, the small jar of coins she kept hidden under her bed. He remembered the nights he sang on their rooftop, believing no one would ever hear him beyond the rusted railings and narrow alleyways. Each memory infused his voice with a depth that transcended technique. This wasn't just singing, it was releasing everything he had held in his heart for years. The longing, the gratitude, the pain, the hope, all rising with every note, like a fragile prayer carried on a golden ribbon of sound. In the audience, something began to shift. People who came expecting an ordinary audition found themselves wiping their eyes. Some felt their chests tighten, moved by a voice that carried sincerity rarely heard. The judges, initially frozen in surprise, now listened with softened expressions. Their eyes glistened, not merely impressed, but deeply touched. Even Simon, known for his stern composure, remained still, leaning slightly forward. It wasn't the power of the voice alone that held him, it was the emotion behind it. The kind of emotion that couldn't be faked. The kind that came only from a life shaped by quiet resilience. The room felt suspended between breaths as Elias approached the final note. And when he released it, it soared, pure, trembling, and achingly beautiful. A note that felt like a goodbye to his fears, and a hello to a future he never thought he deserved. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of tears, full of awe, full of the impact of a boy who had just given the world a piece of his heart. When the final golden note faded into the air, the silence in the auditorium felt almost sacred. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for applause, it demanded awe. For a few heartbeats, no one moved. Not the audience. Not the judges. Not even Elias, who stood trembling under the blinding lights, unsure if what had just happened was real. Then, as if the room suddenly remembered how to breathe, the entire crowd erupted. A wave of applause crashed over the stage, loud, thunderous, overflowing with emotion. People rose from their seats, cheering and clapping with the kind of energy reserved for moments that come once in a lifetime. Some shouted his name. Others simply cried, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. Elias didn't celebrate. He didn't bow or raise his hands. Instead, he pressed his palms against his trembling chest, trying to steady the storm of emotions inside him. All he felt was disbelief. And gratitude. And the weight of every sacrifice that had led him there. Behind the stage, Lara watched through the narrow gap in the curtains. Tears streamed down her face as she saw her son standing in front of thousands, embraced by applause she never dreamed would reach him. Her heart felt both heavy and light, heavy with memories of the struggles, light with the realization that they had been worth everything. When the judges finally stood and offered their standing ovation, it became clear this moment wasn't just a performance. It was history. Cameras flashed rapidly, capturing a boy who had walked onto the AGT stage like a quiet shadow and transformed into something radiant, someone the world couldn't ignore. As Elias stepped back in disbelief, Lara rushed forward. Her arms wrapped around him, pulling him into the warmth that had carried him through every hardship. The audience watched the reunion, mother and son holding each other through tears, as if witnessing the heart of the performance itself. Within hours, clips of his audition spread across social media. People around the world replayed the moment where the judges froze, where a quiet boy from Manila unleashed a golden voice that felt untouched by time. Headlines began calling him the Filipino Elvis, celebrating a sound that felt both nostalgic and new. But Elias remained the same, humble, grounded, deeply aware that this wasn't just his victory. It was theirs. His mother's. His voices. His country's. The world had met Filipino Elvis. But Elias had met something even more powerful, belief.